I mean, that's a really good question. What I meant was not that we forget the past. What I meant by it is that we don't let it dictate the present, right? Here is the problem with retrieval, any retrieval, historical retrieval. History is not natural, it is recorded, right? And when it is recorded, it is motivated at both ends. Someone writes it and records it, his or her or their politics, their contextual politics is inscribed in that, right? The moment a human hand touches a text, that text can no longer be unmotivated. And then we go and retrieve texts to read. That's how we learn history, right? Which texts we privilege, which texts we consider important, unimportant, decides our view of the history, right? And then based on that history, we define a praxis, right? We define what constitutes being good, what constitutes being nice, what constitutes being responsible. So acknowledging that that retrieval in itself is a human retrieval, and it is done through text, already tells us that there can be varied retrievals of the past. And then choosing from amongst them the one that makes more possibilities possible, right? Instead of restricting life for people, right? That is important. Then you look at the present, right? Present is never necessarily overdetermined by a past. Sometimes there are breaks in history. Things happen which were not even imagined, right? You look at the present gives you where you are in discursive terms. You define it with your politics, with your grounded reality, where you are, which ideology you follow. That gives you an idea of the presence. That gives you an idea of what you think is right and what you think is wrong. And if you infuse that present with thoughts that you might not agree with, but which could be valid, right? And which could be practical and which enable more people, then you have complicated your understanding of the world. And then, as Foucault famously pointed out to Chomsky, we cannot discuss the future. We cannot imagine it because we don't have the language of future to talk about it, right? It's not available to us. Anytime we talk about the future, we reduce it to the language of the present, right? But there is no harm in imagining it, right? The problem with preconceived ideological positions, and we all live in an ideology, of course, is that they create exclusions. They create what is permissible, what is not, what is right, what is wrong, before we have encountered our others, before we have talked to them, before we have gotten to know them. And I think if we could dislodge that and loosen that up a little bit, then it doesn't matter. Knowing that I am in an ideology is okay, because then it's a choice. Then you know that given a different set of circumstances, you could have been in another ideology, right? Because there is nothing natural about it. Let me give you like an example from Maulana Maududi, right? In one of his books, he's talking about what constitutes being a Muslim, right? And what he says is that no one is born a Muslim, okay? You become a Muslim, right? That is why the rules are different for children and different for adults, because after you have achieved adulthood, you now are responsible for your actions as a Muslim. So, similarly, no one is born a Christian, right? The religions that claim some kind of hereditary identity already have the problem of how to perpetuate them because they don't allow conversions, right? So, everything is socially produced, and then it becomes our truth, right? And that's all I'm trying to point out, that to acknowledge that historical retrievals are motivated. They are motivated by our ideologies, by our politics, by what we prefer, and that it is never an unmotivated retrieval. You know, there is human agency involved in that. And that's all. Otherwise, I have no idea about the future or how to change it. I'm just like kind of too busy dealing with the present, right? Thank you, though. It's a really good question. If I understand your question correctly, what you wanted me to talk about is that when we read a text or any literary text, we form our own opinions about it, we analyze it, right? And we have certain ideas about it. But then, how do we write about a given text and also be aware of the theoretical debates that might have a bearing upon it and the theory itself, right?
Yeah.
So that's a really, really interesting and complicated question again, because the moment you say that when we read a text, what you bring to a text is a reading self, right? Now that reading self then depends where is it situated, right? So if you are an undergraduate writer, you are at a different level of entry, right? Because you have not read a lot, you have not formed your opinions. So when you write a paper for me as a bachelor's student, I will read it differently because my job is to give you extra advice as to how to make it better. So that's a different kind of writing. But even for that writing, you will have to come from a place of knowledge, right? Basic research would be, I am using this concept. Do I know what this concept is? Have I discussed it in the body of my paper? And now I'm going to read this novel and these particular things. Am I following the structure of a paper, and do I understand it correctly? That knowledge would be a prerequisite. Now, then you go to a slightly higher level. You're an MPhil student, you're a PhD student, and you're writing an article. Let's say I have Salman Rushdie's new book, Quixote, right? It just came out last year, right? Now, it depends, where are you going to publish it? Who is your audience? So if you're going to publish it in Pakistan and you know where the debate is on this topic, then you're entering that debate. The level of your sophistication required for you to publish there will presuppose that you have read the book and that you have a certain degree of expertise in reading a novel, and then you're placing it within the larger debate of Rushdie's work and the novel, and then it will be
Vis-a-vis
reviewed
on
and
MPhil.
published. Now, if you want to compete, if you want to go and discuss it with people here in the United States, you can still bring your own cultural insights and enhance the debate, but you have to know where the debate is. You have to have that knowledge, and you have to be privy to the vocabularies being used over here, and then add the layer of knowledge that you bring from your own cultural experience to it, and then you have a paper that expresses you, but that also knows where it is entering the conversation. So, I mean, keep in mind, a lot of foreigners, people like us, teach in American universities. Some people teach physics, some teach math. It's easy to teach physics if you know English. The principles are the same. But when you teach literature, when you teach culture, you don't just teach the text, right? You have to learn the living culture in which you exist, its vocabularies, its nuances, right? And that is what you publish in. So, to conclude, the self that you started with, the self that will write that paper, is the thing that you need to work on, right? How well read is that self? How much of the theory, whichever particular field that you're specializing in, have you read and learned and mastered, right? And then that self, when it reads a text, it will read it completely differently, right? So plot yourself where you are, right? And that would tell you what your point of entry is. I mean, I know it's not a very practical advice, but when my graduate students come and ask me questions, I was like, how much do you read every day? And they're like, just for the classes, and I tell them read 2 hours a day, nothing related to your classes, but on your field, and do it for 20 years. And then you will wake up one day and say, I know a little bit. Right?